say my name. All right. So, welcome everyone. My name is Jason Waterman. I'm very happy to be with you all today. And so, I know many of you have been in this group, in this setting before, but we'll sit for about 30 minutes and I'll provide some guidance during that sit. Definitely leave some space from silence within it. Then I'll bring us out of that meditation around 11 Eastern time if you're in a different time zone, but 30 minutes from now. And then we'll have maybe a very short break and a little mindful movement led by Emily. And then we will have time for a talk and some discussion about that talk. We're going to be talking about two Pali terms that, yeah, I don't hear used that often, samvega and pasada. And yeah, exploring right intention and motivation and understanding and sense of spiritual urgency and creating a sense of a balance of urgency and faith and practice. And yeah, sort of a very rich playing field there. But for now, you can start finding your comfortable meditative posture, and whatever that looks like for you. Finding a sense of stability wherever you are. Again, standing or lying down will be perfectly fine. But often helpful to have a somewhat upright spine, not too rigid. Allow the eyes to gently rest. And if you prefer, you can just gaze softly at the ground a few feet in front of you. If it seems more suitable to have the eyes open. Just allowing the hands to rest where they may. Just finding both the mental and physical sense of balance in our posture. As we arrive in this moment, just recognizing your intention for being here today. Or for me, it's often a sense of desire to be loving. Is to be happy, and to assist all beings in being free from suffering. Just tapping into that sense of intention. Just becoming aware that there is a body sitting, there is a body breathing. Now, as you become aware, body sitting and body breathing, just noticing if there's any obvious areas of tension. And just taking some time to invite that tension to release. Welcoming this sense of softening to the muscles of the face, around the eyes and the ears, the cheeks and the jaw. So maybe even elongating the exhales as you invite this tension to release, inviting the neck and the shoulders to drop down away from the ears. And just moving through the rest of the body at your own pace. And we can't force tension to stay or to go. All we do is offer the invitation. Once this invitation has been offered throughout the body, Just allowing the body to feel, to be, however it is in this moment. Saying yes to whatever feelings are here in this moment, whether they're pleasant or unpleasant or neutral. And we can do the same for any sounds, any smells, any tastes that are here in this moment. Just allowing this moment to be as it already is, flowing, changing, imperfect and personal. Even recognizing thoughts or stories or beliefs being held in the mind in this moment. Just allowing them to be, allowing sounds to be sounds, sensations to be sensations, thoughts to be thoughts. Just bringing the attention back to resting on the sensations of the body breathing. Aware of the belly rising and falling. And the ribs floating from in to out. Chest expanding, collapsing. The air flowing past the upper lip and through the nostrils, down the windpipe. Maybe resting the attention on one of these points of breath, or maybe aware of the progression of breath as it moves through the body, or even holding the whole body in your field of awareness as it breathes. allowing breath to be breath. Not a right breath or a wrong breath. This one breath and another. Nothing to control, to fix, to get rid of. Nothing to cling to. Just allowing each breath to be impermanent, impersonal, imperfect. It's exactly as it already is. And in these final minutes of the meditation, you may take a moment to call back to your intention for being here today. Maybe connecting with that, maybe offering some metta, loving kindness to others, to ourselves, and dedicating the merit of this practice, the goodness of it, to all beings with no exceptions. And reflecting in the goodness of practice. And in your own time, taking a few final deep breaths. And whenever you're ready, gently opening the eyes. Just maintaining a little bit of awareness of what it's like to be you, even as we come out of meditation. So now we're going to get into today's Dharma talk, and then we'll have some space afterwards for discussion and reflection on today's practice, on that talk, and any of the themes that come up there. So I do want to start though with, and I'll give a little more explanation later, just it is traditional in certain monastic and lay traditions to offer a small chant in Pali, in the language of the Buddha, just before giving a Dharma talk. And so I'm going to do that very briefly, and I'll give a little more context to it later, but it's very, very short. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So today's talk is kind of inspired by a lot of conversations I've been having lately. Um, I hear a lot of questions in my life about how to do something. Okay, there's how do I eat healthier? How do I make more friends? And one of our favorite ones is how do I be happy? Okay, in this context that we're in now, there's a lot of questions around how do I meditate? How do I meditate when boredom arises? How do I meditate when restlessness arises? Or maybe something more specific, like how do I reach the fourth jhana? How do I gain stream entry? Okay. And again, these questions are important, and I think can be important in different contexts, certainly. But to me, it's much more important to focus on the why than the how. Okay, and so, even in this talk, I will be a hypocrite and I will describe how to do things. So again, it's very relevant, but focusing on our why is what, to me, carries us forward. So, and it makes sense, right? Knowing how to do something is pretty useless if we do not have the motivation to actually do that thing. And so we also live in this world in which we have so many resources to figure out how to do something. The hard part is the motivation. And so here we're talking really about why we practice, why we meditate, why we follow the Dharma. In the end, to me, the why is staying connected to that why is more important than the how. The how tends to figure itself out, right? If we are connected enough to our why. Again, to sort of steal some language from Viktor Frankl, who wrote the books Man's Search for Meaning, says that if you have a why, you can suffer anyhow. So to me, focusing on the why and having resolve and clarity in our why is much more powerful to continuing to keep us on the path of practice. And then the how tends to work itself out. So our why is very important because, in today's world, we have a lot of alternatives to practice, just in terms of how we spend our time, right? There are so many tempting things in our world, okay? The candies, the screens, the drugs, the whatever, all these things that are, there are lots of things we could be doing instead of being here practicing. There's so many pleasures, sense pleasures, stimulations available at our fingertips. And I think a lot about this. There was a translation I read many years ago of a Zen master Dogen who lived in the 1200s. He's thought of as being somewhat responsible for proliferating Zen Buddhism in Japan. And he was asked, a question from someone in his community. And the question basically was saying that, I get why someone who has nothing going on in their life would meditate, but I can be playing with, the quote was, steel and stone. So why would I meditate? And basically what he's insinuating with this question is that why would he meditate, or how would he be able to focus in meditation when he had such good alternatives, such as playing with fire, creating sparks and playing with fire? That was so tempting for him that it's like, why would I meditate? Like, this is so fun, playing with fire. And so I think about that story a lot because I think there's something to the idea that the mind always finds a distraction, an alternative, a way of not turning inward. Yeah, but I also think that it's amazing how many distractions we have available to us today compared to then, which is just, something like playing with fire. So our why has to be strong enough to beat out something like not only playing with fire, but, you know, binge watching Netflix. And the thing I haven't said yet is that we sort of know what our why is for what we practice. And the answer to that is suffering. None of us would be here without suffering, correct? If you had no suffering in your life, then yeah, I'd not hold it against anyone if they just say, oh, I don't have suffering, I'm getting off this call right now. Go for it. If anyone doesn't experience suffering, then enjoy the rest of your day. But we're obviously all here because we suffer and we are seeking a path out of that suffering. And again, that's what, I can't remember if I heard this from someone else or if I made it up myself actually, but when asked the question of why do you practice, the answer is, well, basically, I just tried everything else and nothing else was working. Okay, so it can be, that can be part of the why, certainly. But the key is, how do we stay connected to that why? Because our motivation to practice, it ebbs and it flows depending on how connected to that why we are. And it's easy to get dragged away by some of these other, what we might call false refuges, other ways that sort of promise happiness, but at the end do not deliver it. So to frame this conversation, I want to talk about two words from the Pali language, the language of the Buddha that I mentioned earlier, samvega and pasada. And these are actually two feelings or two emotions that the Buddha actually experienced that sort of led to him taking this path to awakening. And so I'm going to share just very briefly a little bit about the context of the Buddha's life in which he felt these emotions. So many of you may be familiar with some of the story of the Buddha's early life, but I'll give a very sort of condensed version just to give context for these two words. But the Buddha was born into what I describe as an extremely privileged and sheltered life. So he was born to a king, and it was actually prophesied at his birth that he would grow up to either become a powerful king or a great spiritual leader. And the Buddha's dad preferred that he would be a powerful king, just like he was. So his dad basically created an environment in which the Buddha would not face any suffering at all, because he knew that seeing suffering might take him towards the spiritual path. So the Buddha lives a very luxurious early life in palaces for every season, they say, and all this most luxurious goods, sense pleasures, the finest foods, all of those things. But of course, that can only last so long, and the Buddha's starts itching to get outside of the palace walls and to see life outside. So unbeknownst to his father, he gets out of the palace walls in the back of a chariot one day, and he sees four things, or four people specifically, that he'd never seen before that changed his life. So the first thing he sees is he sees someone who is extremely old. Within his palace walls, he had never even seen someone who was very, very old. And seeing this, he realizes, oh, well, that's going to happen to me too, right? Okay, and then he continues on. He sees someone who is sick. And he's never even been around a sick person before. He's been shielded from all that. And he realizes, oh, well, that's actually something that can happen to me too. And then he sees a corpse, a dead body. And he goes, oh, wow, this is, something that will eventually happen to me too. This is something, again, he was shielded from the idea of death, even though, his mother died kind of in the first week of his life, but, he was too young to really be conscious of that. So he saw these three people, and then he saw a fourth person. And the fourth person was a spiritual wanderer, someone who is basically seeking a path of liberation, of escaping the suffering. And so within this story, the Buddha felt these two different emotions. The first, samvega. Samvega is what the Buddha felt when he saw the first three people. Okay? The person who was aging, the person who was sick, and the person who was dead. So samvega, there's not a direct English translation for this word samvega. So I'll read a sort of extended definition. This is taken directly from Thanissaro Bhikkhu. They describe samvega as the oppressive sense of shock, dismay, and alienation that comes with realizing the futility and meaninglessness of life as it's normally lived. A chastening sense of our own complacency and foolishness in having let ourselves live so blindly, and an anxious sense of urgency in trying to find a way out of the meaningless cycle. So that's kind of a longer definition, but a shorter definition sometimes is just described as spiritual urgency. Okay? So samvega is this spiritual urgency, this sense of shock and dismay, and this like kind of like, wow, like waking us up to the reality of the world around us. And samvega, what it does is it helps us develop, I'll use another Pali word, is virya, which is basically energy. It's something like energy in the form of courageous effort. Or the Joseph Goldstein describes virya as the valor of truly being present. So samvega, this sense of kind of shock, this spiritual urgency, creates the energy that then helps us practice. And of course, samvega can be held at bay by distraction and denial, which of course is what the Buddha's father was using for the Buddha. Some people, including maybe myself, would argue that our society is basically designed around denial and distraction, and that's actually its very function. It's kind of a feature, not a bug, but I'll leave more of that commentary for another day. But this brings us to the idea of how do we actually cultivate samvega. So you can probably intuit from the story, the predominant way of cultivating samvega is reflecting on aging, sickness, and death. Again, the Buddha recommended that all practitioners, whether they are monks or not monks, nuns, whatever, that every day they reflect on aging, sickness, and death. And this creates an unpleasant feeling, but in Buddhism, there's wholesome feelings that are also unpleasant, and this is considered the wholesome but unpleasant feeling. And there's lots of practices that, reflect on death, called Maranasati meditations. One that's very popular and very much aligns with the Buddha's experience is just called the five remembrances, which many of you may be familiar with. But I'll just read through those very quickly and just to give you an idea of what those. And I try and incorporate this in my practice every day. Not that I'm successful in doing that, but I aim to. And the five recollections are that I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape ill health. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. My actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. My actions are the ground upon which I stand. And that's a translation by Thich Nhat Hanh of the Anguttara Nikaya. But this is one way that, we can create this sense of samvega in our life, this spiritual urgency. And, I sometimes reflect on other texts. I often reflect on a verse from the Dhammapada that says, mindfulness is the path to the deathless. Mindlessness is the path to death. The mindful die not. The mindless are as if already dead. Okay? It's pretty dramatic. I do other things. Like I have this plant here. This is about as dead of a plant as I can have. It's been dead for months. I keep it around. It actually relaxes me. I'm not totally sure why. But again, it's just a little way of keeping this sort of reminder of impermanence around. So that's samvega. Pasada is the other emotion or feeling that the Buddha had during this experience. This is what the Buddha felt when he saw the spiritual wanderer, which is basically to see that there is a path. So pasada is often translated, again, there's not a direct English translation for it. Something like clarity and serene confidence can be used for it. But pasada can be thought of sort of as like an inspiration. A trust in our own actions and understanding that through the way that we live our life, that we and other people can escape suffering. One way of framing it is having a trust in the practice or a confidence in the path. And this is what keeps samvega from turning into despair. Pasada is the balancing force, sort of an evolution in a way of samvega. And again, because a lot of people in our modern society, it's like, I don't need any more reminders that things are terrible. I need hope, I need faith. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that nuance, but samvega is this balancing force. It's like the spiritual urgency is helping us wake up, but then we have to have this balancing force of some trust and some faith and some confidence and clarity about the path to know that we can move through this suffering. And just to stay on this point for a moment is that, I have a quote from Mr. Bhikkhu who, I call upon, was reading his work to define these terms. But he points out that in pasada, we see that the true cause of suffering is not out there somewhere, even in society or some outside being, but it's in here. It's in the craving present in each individual mind. And I wanted to highlight this point because I think this is such an important piece of it, that there is like a radical ownership that happens with pasada. So a lot of times, again, we respond to samvega, this sense of dismay, with despair. And we have this resignation that, everything out there sucks and we have no agency in that. And there's within that really this egoic story of self with guilt about our place in society, or a story about what we should be doing, or strong feelings of I like this, I don't like that, a feeling that this shouldn't be happening, that things should be happening the way I want them to. Okay, so this is not right view. Right view, the first step of the no eightfold path, is about seeing and accepting reality as it is. Okay, seeing the suffering, the impersonal nature of things, okay, the impermanence of things. This is about seeing and accepting that reality as it is. But oftentimes, we do things like we read these news stories and we stew in our anger and we create these fixed stories about self and others. And this can easily turn samvega into a sense of nihilism. It actually diminishes the power of practice. And we have these thoughts like, what's the point anyway? Again, that's the most common human reaction to overwhelm, is shutting down. And we have these thoughts like, oh, well, when things get a little less intense in my life or in the world or scary, then I'll practice more. And again, these stories, these thoughts are all basically egoic protective mechanisms that actually stop us from being with the deep hurt of suffering, that prevent us from being truly mindful of this feeling. It's sort of just keeping the mind on these loops. But when we can be truly present with suffering and sort of lean in deeply to that samvega, we let it cut us deeply, and that's where wisdom comes from. Okay, suffering is a gateway to liberation. It can be, but we oftentimes sip on the stories of suffering rather than feeling into the suffering itself and being mad that the suffering exists, rather than, again, it's fine to be some upset at certain suffering existing in the world. That is an extremely useful function. But then can we be with it? Can we have, that energy, that courage to sit with that discomfort, the fact of how much is out of our control and how much of it is not something that things are not the way you want them to be. And the beauty of this all is that the Buddha's teaching offers a way of living in the world without being overcome by the world. The doing things like following a life of generosity, being virtuous, practicing, cultivating the mind through meditation, through other practices, that we can move towards the end of suffering. So to cultivate pasada, which again, this confidence in the path, this sort of serene clarity, like in the story, he finds inspiration from seeing a spiritual wanderer. And we can do the same thing. We find inspiration from teachers. We find inspiration from even community. Okay? I read a lot of Dharma books, even though a lot of them end up saying the exact same thing, but it orients my mind towards this sort of inspiration, towards this way of seeing, towards this perspective of hope, of being able to move through taking this kind of spiritual dismay and actually turning it into a path forward, something powerful. So there are other things we can do. We can reflect on our precious human birth is another recommendation for this. That one's always actually a little bit of a hard one for me. But, even something like the chanting I did at the beginning, that chanting I did is just paying homage to the Buddha, basically. And to me, it's just like helping me stay connected to the tradition in which I'm a part of. That's a powerful thing to me. That helps me feel like, oh, I'm on a path that has been walked before, that other people have kind of set out before, and that I can sort of follow that and believe in that and trust in that and feeling connected to them in that way can be really powerful. So another thing we can do is we can focus on right intention, and we did that in today's meditation. Okay, so we can, you know, orient our mind around what inspires us, what motivates us. We can recognize what the path can offer us. And coming back to that intention again and again, this is coming back to our why, to our motivation. This is really helpful, and we can bring in wholesome, positive intentions for practice and also accept that it's okay if all your intentions are perfectly pure. That's fine. None of us, as far as I know, are perfectly enlightened beings. And maybe we get to a place where, I show up to meditate every day out of a place of pure self-compassion, a belief, the complete worthiness of being happy. Maybe it's just curiosity or joy or wonder, or that pure sense of love for all beings, the bodhisattva ideal of wishing for all beings to be free of suffering. But this is something we cultivate. I've been on retreat once with Joseph Goldstein, and he was, sharing that do not wait to take action before your intention or your why is perfectly pure. He talked about when he started teaching, he's wants to spread the Dharma because he loves others, but he's also like, wow, today I had 12 people show up to see me, and yesterday I only had 10. Hey, it's like, yeah, his ego is involved, but that helps him maybe get started, but then can we transition to that more wholesome feeling, that more wholesome ideal, the more wholesome intention of just wanting to give the gift of Dharma? So again, it's okay if you don't show up with perfect intention, if your spiritual urgency isn't perfectly awakened, if you do not have perfect faith in the path. Again, sometimes it's just showing up is actually what gives us faith. Again, practice, the paradox of motivation, really at its core is that, especially in Buddhism, is that, the Buddha always talks about ehipassiko, come and see for yourself. So he says, if you practice and you see the benefits of practice, then you will be motivated to practice more. The paradox here is that this is a bit of a chicken or egg situation, right? Is that why would you be motivated to practice if you have not felt the fruit of practice, which is then the motivation to practice? So again, this is a huge conundrum, and it's true outside of the context of Buddhism too. One of the things I advocate for most with, clients I'm seeing in like a therapy setting are that motivation is actually a byproduct of action. We often think of it as the opposite. People are like, oh, I need to be here to get motivated and then I will take action. No, action is what motivates you. And it's paradoxical, but that is oftentimes how it works. So we can find any way to get on the cushion, even if it's peer pressure. Again, in the long term, it matters if your intention for meditating is, I think I'm broken or messed up and I need to fix myself through meditation. But again, find your way to the cushion, and then we can try and tap into these more wholesome motivations, these sense of why. Because again, what's the motivation for feeling or being aware of the five remembrances? Okay, we have to find a way to practice that in order for that to be the motivation that gets us to continue the practice. Because the strongest way to cultivate pasada is through practice. And that leads to, I'll introduce one other word, is avecha pasada. Avecha pasada, so pasada is sort of this confidence and clarity in the practice and the path. Avecha means basically verified. So avecha pasada is like a verified confidence or a verified clarity in the path, and we get that through practice. So again, the Buddha really preached this, is okay. If you practice, you will be motivated to practice because practice will become your reason why. You will see the fruit that is born of it. So again, finding a way, even if it's, okay, I'm gonna, maybe this is blasphemous, but I've done this to people where I will say, okay, we have, working with a friend or we're trying to start some new habit. So for example, if we say, I'm going to go to the CML sit every single morning. If I'm not there and you're there, I owe you $100. I will suddenly become an avid meditator. Okay? So we can do that, but then we do want to incorporate this greater sense of why. So initially we focus on just why do we show up for practice? And then as we get that little why done, then we tap into this bigger why, the samvega, this pasada. Because that is what is the sustainable why that keeps us moving forward. So again, samvega is this strong sense of spiritual urgency, of dismay, and that, yeah, is great motivation to practice. But it's the serene confidence in the path, the pasada, that sort of balances that out. That is this sort of evolution of samvega. And that keeps us motivated. And we can know this in ourselves if we pay attention. What do we feel like we need more of at a given time? Again, it can change, it can ebb, it can flow. Some of you might be in this moment like, wow, I feel like I have a lot of samvega and very little pasada. Or I have a lot of pasada but very little samvega. But this is something through awareness that we can focus on, correct for. Because again, to me, this talk is all about if we are connected to a why, then we can suffer anyhow. So finding ways of being connected to our why is what keeps us moving forward on the path. And I have the utmost confidence that staying on the path will bear fruit. And so that's my talk for today.